I'm not able to hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly fine, sir. Okay. I was on mute myself. We're just waiting for the acting president to arrive.
Sure. All well and clear. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Iqbal Khan. Very sorry for the delay. We're just waiting for our acting president to arrive, and then we'll commence proceedings.
Sorry, I was mute.
No worries, sir. No worries.
Yeah. How many participants we have?
We have 5 speakers in our panel. As far as the participants are concerned, if you're asking about the viewers, they'll join us through YouTube. So yes, I'm hoping we have a significant amount because this is an important webinar.
All right. So are you planning to record it also?
The webinar will be recorded simultaneously to Zoom. This will be live streamed on YouTube as well. This is a new format that IPRI is trying, I believe. We'll see how it works with the amount of views that we have. But yes, it will be recorded on Zoom as well.
All right. I'm sorry I didn't pay my homage and salam to other speakers, Shad Saab, Ma'am Nur Fatma, Dr. Huma, Haji Sultan Saab. Assalamu alaikum from my side, please.
Assalamu alaikum ji. How are you, Iqbal Saab?
Good, good. How are you doing?
Alhamdulillah ji. All is well. Surviving. I always tell my friends that as long as you have a pulse, you've got a reason to be happy these days.
Yeah, really. I'm a bit down for the past 3-4 days. And whenever you're a bit down, you have this apprehension of God, So,
Sure.
Yeah.
Bas thodi ehtiyat kare, just keep, make sure that you don't go in the wrong places, you wear a mask and all that.
That all we are doing, but still it has become so rampant now. So
I know. It's a challenge for all of us.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin now. We have all our speakers and panelists on board. Assalamu alaikum and a very good evening. On behalf of Islamabad Policy Research Institute, I welcome you all to today's webinar titled Deconstructing FATF Through a Legal Lens. Now, today's webinar is meant to understand and analyze Pakistan's legal recourse to moving out of the grey list. Such measures, of course, cannot be understood independently of an assessment of Pakistan's current standing vis-a-vis the FATF, as well as arguably its impact on Pakistan's standing in the world across. In addition, today's webinar will feature a discussion on the use of lawfare against Pakistan and the means available to Pakistan to counter that use. Before we commence with the introductions and presentations of the speakers, I would like to request Acting President IPRI, Brigadier Rashid Wali Janjua, for his opening remarks. Over to you, sir. Sir, you're on mute.
Okay.
So you're on mute now.
Okay. I welcome all the distinguished panelists on this very important webinar on behalf of Islamabad Policy Research Institute. And this webinar is going to yield some very important conclusions because Financial Action Task Force, we all know, is an intergovernmental body established in 1989 by the ministers of its member jurisdictions with a purpose. And unless we are clear about the objectives and purposes of this organization, it's not possible to parse open its ultimate objectives, which are impacting countries like Pakistan. Now, ostensible objectives of the FATF are to set standards and to promote effective implementation of legal, regulatory, and operational measures for combating money laundering, terrorist financing, and other related threats to the integrity of the international financial system. The Financial Action Task Force is a veritable instrument that works fine for those who want to extract maximum concessions out of an economically harried and geopolitically beleaguered Pakistan. India has been the silent instigator of several FATF strictures imposed upon Pakistan. The mutual evaluation by all member states through consensus of a potential target state of the new members to be invited is also a subject to the whims and caprices of any stronger member state. India plays its negative part, duly supported by other allies, in making things difficult for Pakistan. The mutual evaluation provisions through which the existing member states scrutinize Pakistan's current compliance on 40-odd recommendations of any anti-money laundering and combating financing of terrorism is a ready peg to hang terrorist financing facilitation allegations. Till now, Pakistan has addressed 23 out of 27 action items of FATF's action plan statement. But the monitoring mechanism of FATF is more political than technical. And it creates problems for Pakistan because the compliance on technical and legal issues can be ensured, but subjectivity and bias cannot be effectively combated. With these two words, I lay out the turf for our distinguished panelists, and we would like to be enlightened on all legal and administrative and terrorism financing related issues. And the real purpose is to garner the relevant inputs so as to be able to put out the actionable recommendations to our policymakers. And we all are there at after the IPRI. Please.
Dr. Huma, would you please like to unmute your mic?
Okay, no issue, no issue.
Sorry.
So with these few words, I hand it over to Waleed to invite the respective speakers to say their piece, and we'll hope to have a very absorbing Q&A session after that. So over to you, Waleed.
Thank you, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, we have an esteemed panel of 5 speakers joining us today for the webinar. It is my pleasure to introduce them to our audience. Our first speaker is Ms. Noor Fatma. She is a research associate at RSI's Lahore office and works primarily on challenges associated with the anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism frameworks in Pakistan. Previously, Ms. Fatma has worked at the Global Justice Lab, aiding clients from the government of Nigeria in developing evaluative indicators and improving bail and remand procedures. Second up is Mr. Muhammad Iqbal Khan, who is the former Director General, National Counterterrorism Authority, and is currently the Director General, Intelligence and Investigation at FPR. Our third speaker is Mr. Ali Sultan, who is an international law expert and currently teaches at the Foreign Service Academy. Our fourth speaker is Dr. Huma Bakai. Dr. Bakai is an Associate Professor of Social Sciences and Liberal Arts and former Associate Dean at the Faculty of Business Administration, IBA, Karachi. She has been working with national and international media as an international relations expert and political analyst since 1999, and has served both as media analyst and an anchor person at various media organizations. Following Dr. Bakai is Mr. Hassan Aslam Shad, who is a practicing international law expert based out of the Middle East. He is a graduate of Harvard Law School and the first Pakistani to intern at the Office of the President of the International Criminal Court at The Hague. Thank you for joining us, ladies and gentlemen. Before we begin with the presentations, I would request our audience to please keep sending in their questions in the comment section of the YouTube live stream. With that, I would like to invite our first speaker, Ms. Noor Fatma, to take the stage. She'll be addressing, or rather assessing, the compliance measures required of Pakistan and the legislative measures undertaken on anti-money laundering. Ms. Fatma.
Thank you so much for this opportunity and for arranging the seminar. These are very important questions, especially now that we're at the very end of completing our FATF action plan. And money laundering, if I just can launch into the nitty-gritties of it, money laundering as an offense is something that requires a holistic, coordinated approach from not just law enforcement agencies to counter and investigate and prosecute effectively, but also requires legislative reforms so that the predicate offenses that lead to money laundering can be nipped at the bud. When we look at FATF recommendations, we see that a lot of these recommendations pertain towards simplistic elements such as customer due diligence, making sure that the customers that any business entity deals with, they are not involved in any criminal activities, any predicate offenses, or of anything of the sort. Record keeping, correspondence banking relationships, ensuring that politically exposed persons are not involved, or if they are involved, they are conducting transactions, then there are controls in place for that. When we look at the money laundering scenario in Pakistan, we see that the first money laundering act that came into place was in 2010, after Pakistan had been grey-listed by the FATF for the first time. Before that, we had an ordinance, the money laundering ordinance, that had lapsed by that point. So when it comes to assessing our legal frameworks, we can see that until and unless we got the push from FATF, we were targeted by FATF for not implementing money laundering or anti-money laundering measures in our country. Pakistan really did not work much on that front. FATF's own assessment procedures have evolved in the last 10 years. And with that, Pakistan has responded. However, we find ourselves coming up short every time. First in 2018, and before that in 2015. It's been a journey for Pakistan. However, with June 2018, it is critical to note that this was a point of no return for Pakistan. And following up with this, Pakistan worked on and passed around 15 laws, including wholesale changes to our anti-terrorism frameworks, our anti-money laundering frameworks, the way our banking sector was regulated, the way our companies, SECP, other regulators were functioning. This was critical in becoming compliant with not just the FATF recommendations as they stand, but also the specific action plan that was handed to Pakistan by FATF so that it can get off the grey list. I'm going to speak a little bit about one particular act that was the most significant, which is the Anti-Money Laundering Second Amendment Act, which was passed around September 2020 in a joint parliamentary session. The key things to note from this piece of law is that under Section 21, the offense of money laundering has now been rendered cognizable, which means that investigating officers now do not require an arrest warrant or a court order to proceed under the AMLA Act. And this was critical, and it allowed us to fulfill some of the core FATF recommendations. Following that, there's an enhanced role for the National Accountability Bureau as well as an investigating authority, which created a lot of political furor as well. Penalties have been made more stringent. And importantly, I would really like to highlight this. There are sectors of the economy in Pakistan that are known as DNFBPs, designated non-financial businesses and professions. These includes accountants, lawyers, jewelry sector, real estate sector. These sectors of the economy are often at the forefront of money laundering and predicate offenses. These sectors, this is where money is parked, illegal money is parked, black money is parked. And prior to the AMLA Second Amendment, we did not have much of a legal framework to regulate and to supervise these frameworks. These sectors, pardon me. So following the second AMLA Second Amendment Act, Pakistan further delineated rules, detailed rules from the State Bank, from the SECP, from the FPR, particularly to regulate the previously unregulated sectors of the economy. Sorry? I'll just continue then. As a result, we are now, as has been mentioned before, compliant with 23 out of the 27 points. And more than that, FATF is also going to conduct its mutual evaluation of Pakistan's frameworks. An on-site inspection is also due, which will look at the progress we've made compared to the 40 recommendations and the 11 immediate outcomes. So it is expected that the progress that we've made thus far, it was direly needed. And it goes beyond the realm of just conducting on-ground action or just going after terrorist organizations. This is sophisticated stuff. This is the stuff that required action because there were no legal frameworks pertaining to this. So it is expected that in the next plenary, June 2021, we will be able to perform well and complete the action plan points. But more than that, when it comes to the 40 FATF recommendations and the 11 immediate outcomes, that we have made significant progress on as well. And it is expected that once we get off the gray list, Pakistan can use its own example as a country that has been in the crossfire for the past more than 20 years as a frontline state, using and upholding its commitment as a member of the international community and targeting all areas of terrorism financing and money laundering that brought it to the FATF grey list. After exiting the grey list, I feel that Pakistan can be a success story. So these are some of the things that I have covered, and I hand it back over to you, Waleed. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Noor. Now, next up, we have Mr. Muhammad Iqbal Khan. Sir, taking cue from Ms. Noor Fatma's presentation, that Pakistan has since now been able to develop a lot in terms of its CFL and AML and CFT regime. How do you see compliance? How do you see measures taken on counterterrorism financing for FATF by Pakistan and future prognosis, in your opinion? Also, you're on mute.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Perfectly audible.
Sorry. Please forgive me for my voice there. Thank you very much. And I would just carry on from where Nur Fatma has left. And she has rightly pointed out that Pakistan, as a matter of fact, is undergoing two FATF processes or two FATF evaluations at the same time, concurrently. One is the Pakistan's mutual evaluation that was completed in 2019. And as a follow-up, we have to come up with certain technical compliance and certain effectiveness measures, and that's something which is in process. And Fatma has already pointed out that there has been a number of legal reforms or legal measures which have been taken by Pakistan, including amendments in 14 or 15, for that matter, laws, and other regulations or secondary legislation which Pakistan has now put into place in relation to all these areas. So this is a process that is going on. And in that regard, Pakistan has made, in my opinion, a phenomenal progress in the past, say, 18 months or so. And that progress perhaps is unprecedented when you look into the number of legal interventions or, for that matter, regulatory interventions that Pakistan has made. Another process that we have in hand, of course, is the FATF action plan. So while the first one, which is the mutual evaluation, is focusing more on both areas, the money laundering as well as financing of terrorism, the FATF action plan, or 7-point action plan that we have in hand, that is focusing on financing of terrorism. And financing of terrorism, as we all know, is a challenge for every jurisdiction, including Pakistan. Now, not going into details at what kind of this action plan we have in hand, not going into details of the complexity that this action plan has, or for that matter, the issues of interpretations as to how an action has to be made. Just looking at the progress that Pakistan has made. And now, since the action plan is focusing only on the part of effectiveness, barring one item that was in relation to technical compliance and that Pakistan has already made. So they are, as a matter of fact, focusing on enforcement measures. Now let's discuss a bit of them as to how Pakistan has taken these measures and where Pakistan stands today. Now, if you look into the FATF action plan, we can divide it into 4 broader categories. One is, of course, in relation to the financial institutions, which are supervised by the State Bank of Pakistan, or for that matter, the Security Exchange Commission of Pakistan. And the second is the area of border controls. Third is the terrorist financing investigations, prosecutions, and convictions. And the fourth area, of course, is in relation to targeted financial sanctions, whether that be under UNSC 1267 or 1373 sanction regimes. Now, if you look into these areas, all the issues related to financial institutions have been settled, and all the actions which fall into that particular category have been addressed by Pakistan. Similarly, all the issues in relation to border controls, for that matter, cash smuggling, which were there in the action plan, have been settled. Also, the issues which related to illegal MBTS, and Hawala Hundi for that matter, have also been addressed by Pakistan. So there are only 3 remaining actions that you all know and has been there in the FATF statement, which are pending as of now. And these relate to terrorist financing investigation, also targeted financial sanctions. But again, in these 3 areas, the majority of the work has already been done. These actions are already partially addressed. And in our opinion, while this last evaluation was made, Pakistan had been able to progress at least up to 90% of the overall requirement. There are very few issues which are left, very minor perhaps in my opinion, which are left as of now. And I'm pretty sure that I'm very hopeful that as we go to the face-to-face meeting and then in the June plenary, we'll be able to address this action then. Now, what Pakistan has been doing so far, apart from the other areas, if you focus on financing of terrorism in relation to investigations, prosecutions, and convictions, Pakistan has come up with a standalone terrorist financing risk assessment, and then that was followed by a national risk assessment, both for money laundering and financing of terrorism. In that, Pakistan has identified the sources of terrorist financing, the channels for movement or transfer of funds, the terrorist organizations which are of relevance to our country, and also identified as to how their vulnerabilities, or for that matter, their threats are posed in this particular jurisdiction. Not only that, Pakistan has come up with a very robust coordination mechanism between the law enforcement agencies and between the other competent authorities. And coordination is very important when we need to pursue the terrorist financing investigations in the real sense. So we have a national task force on CFT and NACTA. Then we have other coordination mechanisms, and at operational level, more importantly, the joint investigation teams, which previously used to be focusing only on terrorism, now there is a great number of GITs which were constituted by Pakistan and which were conducting parallel financial investigations in terrorism cases, number one, and number two, proactive financial investigations at their own. And the canvas or the scope of the GIT was enhanced and extended, first through an SOP by NACTA, and that was followed by an amendment in the ATA. And that is that now the GIT can opt any member with it for the furtherance of that particular investigation. So the very important authorities in Pakistan, for that matter, whether that may be the FMU or the State Bank of Pakistan and SECP. Now, the members from these organizations are now opted in JITs, and they actually help the law enforcement agencies to investigate the financial aspect of that particular inquiry or investigation. Now, Pakistan has come up also with a standalone policy on financial investigations in terrorism cases. That policy was approved by the Prime Minister of Pakistan in January 2019, and that policy has been implemented, which requires inter alia parallel financial investigations in every terrorism case, and also proactive financial investigations of terrorist and terrorist organizations. The area of international cooperation, whether that is an international cooperation that is sought from other jurisdictions, or whether that is an international cooperation that is extended by Pakistan in an effective and in a timely manner, that area has been very much looked into and fostered. And as a result, the international cooperation of Pakistan with other jurisdictions in relation to investigating financing of terrorism has enhanced manifold, and that was an action item that has been addressed by Pakistan. Pakistan has been looking into not only investigating certain specific areas, such as for that matter donations, which was a common factor in Pakistan until recently. Pakistan has been investigating the wide range of TF activities. And when we talk of the wide range of TF activities, then we talk of the cash smuggling, then we talk of the Hawala Hundi, we talk of the misuse of non-profit organizations for purposes of financing of terrorism. And we can talk of the collection of skin and hides during Eid al-Azha and so on and so forth. So this wide range of TF activities was in a robust manner, has been investigated and is being investigated by Pakistan. And that has really yielded very, very positive results in society. So the number of investigations, for instance, or the incidents for that matter, have drastically reduced, very drastically reduced, whether that is in relation to donations or skin heights collections or other particular areas. So there is a long list in relation to targeted financial sanctions. Again, Pakistan has taken over the assets of all the UN designated entities, of that matter, domestically proscribed entities, through a very robust mechanism, starting from the DICs, District Intelligence Committees, which identifies the assets and takes it over. And these assets, if there were any social welfare related assets, for instance, hospitals or dispensaries, etc., they are run now by the government of Pakistan, funded by the government of Pakistan, and have been completely detached from the proscribed organizations. So targeted financial sanctions, both in relation to movable assets and immovable assets, have also been very effectively applied by Pakistan. So there is a long list as we move on as to how much Pakistan has moved or has been able to do in the past 3 years since we have this action plan in hand. And in my opinion, as I had seen it myself personally, I think the progress that Pakistan has made, whether that is in the legal or regulatory domain, whether that is in the institutional domain, or whether that is in the domain of effectiveness or enforcement, I think that is perhaps unprecedented for any jurisdiction in the country. And that's why what I personally feel is that effort of Pakistan is now lauded also and appreciated and acknowledged also by many jurisdictions across the world. And as we move forward, I'm looking forward to a day when Pakistan will be applying for the membership of the FATF, and the countries which have seen remarkable progress made by Pakistan will definitely be endorsing that move. So that's all from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Before moving on to the next speaker, I'd like to remind all our audience members to please keep sending in their questions. On YouTube, we do want this to be an interactive session, so please do keep sending in your questions. Our next speaker is Mr. Ali Sultan. Mr. Ali Sultan will be speaking on the use of lawfare against Pakistan and the legal response to combat it. Mr. Ali Sultan, can you hear me, sir?
Yes, sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you to IPRI and President Brigadier Sahab for his kind introduction. Well, I'm basically going to be talking about lawfare in very general terms because of the time constraints that I have, and also offer some recommendations in terms of how to effectively counter it in terms of the state's options in terms of countering lawfare. And then I'd also want to say very briefly a few words about the Financial Action Task Force as well, and how that fits in with the overall lawfare paradigm. Now, very briefly, in very broad terms, lawfare could be defined as the theory and practice of using international law as an instrument to advance one's interests in the international system. Now, these are primarily advanced by entities in the international system. Who are those entities? States, but it could also be some commercial entities. So think of the Rikodik case against Pakistan. It could also now be certain NGOs which use states as fronts. For example, the Marshall Islands case against Pakistan a few years ago could also be an example of lawfare. So it's not just restricted now to state entities alone. It's all the other entities in the international system that can also use it to their advantage. Now, if you look at what's been happening with Pakistan in the last 10 years or so, we have been the subject of many lawfare moves against us, whether it's strategic litigation, strategic recourse to international courts and tribunals against us by other states, our adversaries such as India, in the case of Kulbhushan Yadav case. Also, the Marshall Islands taking us to the ICJ a few years ago is another example, and so on and so forth. And also commercial investment arbitrations that we have been facing. We had certain bilateral investment treaties which contributed to the unfortunate legal mess that we find ourselves in today, among other factors, of course, as well. So lawfare then, of course, is an instrumentalist approach to international law, and the structure and the nature of international law allows it to be used in such a way. So for the audience and for anybody who wants further proof that one can actually use international law, here's a very introductory book, how to do things with international law. So there's clearly a way in which one can use international law to one's advantage. There's widespread literature that exists on the issue. So it's not just a term which has been invented out of thin air and so on and so forth. So there's doctrinal and there's academic literature behind it as well. So the next thing to understand is that one can, of course, think of lawfare in defensive terms, and one can also think of lawfare in offensive terms. So the title of my talk is supposed to be defensive. What should Pakistan do to defend itself against lawfare? But I would also like to think of Pakistan using international law in offensive terms to advance its interests, foreign policy interests, whether they are traditional military interests, security interests, or now that we have the geoeconomics paradigm, economic interests as well. So think of it not just in defensive terms, but also think of it in offensive terms. I think that's important as well. So what is it about a particular state which makes it vulnerable to lawfare challenges from other entities in the international system? Let's discuss that very briefly. One of the things, of course, is no appreciation or little appreciation for public international law within that state. And that would, of course, lead to issues of capacity within that state, not enough capacity, not enough coordination between agencies, between different units within that state, for example, provinces and the federation, and so on and so forth. That would make any state, including Pakistan, vulnerable to outside challenges, especially when there are gaps in terms of enforcement of domestic enforcement of international law. So every time a state accepts international law obligations, it's also then supposed to give effect to those international obligations in its domestic law. Now, often developing states which do not have the requisite capacity or understanding of the nuances of international law tend to sign on to many international law obligations thoughtlessly, and then do not come up with the required domestic framework to give effect to those obligations. So in the case of FATF, whether we examine it from what happened the first time around in 2008, and also recently in 2015, and since 2015 onwards, has been this gap in our domestic administrative and legal frameworks, which is what, as Noor and Iqbal Saab was pointing out, that's what we've been trying to bridge ever since in order to fulfill this this action point, this action plan which the FATF has handed us. So that's important, ensuring that there is compliance with international law obligations. If there is compliance, because our adversaries are going to exploit these gaps between our international obligations and the domestic enforcement of those international obligations to hold us accountable or to or to sort of burden us through international frameworks like FATF. Another example of this is the GSP Plus status, which again requires us to, to fulfill international law obligations domestically. So that's something that's important too. Now, very briefly, what can we do now? Now that I hope that in very broad terms you have an idea of what lawfare essentially is about and how we've been a victim of it in some ways. Now, moving forward, the first thing that we need to do is develop an appreciation for international law. International law, even within the larger domain of law, is a very specialized expertise. It's not everybody's cup of tea. It takes years of diligence and selected, specialized study to develop an expertise in international law. So you need to build the right kind of capacity. Just filling people up with legal credentials is not going to cut it. You need people with quality, people with competence. Having no advice is better than having bad advice. And Pakistan has been the victim of certain, bad advice from many different actors in the past. So you want to avoid that in the future. So to build the right kind of capacity. Right now, our capacity, whether it's in the Attorney General's office, whether it's in the Ministry of Law and Justice, it's very patchy. And both of those entities are heavily under-resourced, understaffed. So build capacity over there so that every international obligation, every international agreement that Pakistan enters into is properly vetted by those entities. Because international law is not something that can be imposed on a state. Almost always, because of this notion of this foundational principle of state sovereignty, it's the state's voluntary choice to accept a certain international law obligation. So we need to be very careful when we're accepting new international law obligations. And even when we do that, we need to attach reservations, we need to attach declarations along with it in order to protect our interests. So for instance, even now we have signed on to certain agreements in the last 15 or 20 years, which from our standpoint unnecessarily grant jurisdiction to the International Court of Justice. Now, there was no need to do that if we had gone about this in a more structured and a more methodical manner, as opposed to how we did it. Now, so that's the first most important thing. Secondly, if you happen to be engaged in strategic litigation of any kind, then of course the normal practice is to rely on foreign counsels and foreign law firms. That's fine. I have no issues with that. But the method of selection of these foreign counsel needs to be structured and revisited, because in the past we've ended up hiring certain foreign counsel which who didn't really perform as well as we had expected. So that's another important thing moving forward. Thirdly, of course, I would advocate better coordination. Iqbal Saab also talked about it from the context of terrorist financing, better interagency coordination, better interprovincial and federation and provincial coordination, because many times, these obligations cannot be given full effect without the cooperation and coordination of the provinces. So that's also something that needs to be kept in mind. And lastly, in terms of lawfare, again, we don't need to look at it defensively. I would like to see Pakistan treat this in a more proactive fashion rather than in a reactive manner. Time is critical when it comes to these matters, and oftentimes we let go of fantastic opportunities to practice lawfare against our adversaries, to advance our interests, just because either we don't have the capacity or we have this reactive mindset rather than having a proactive mindset. That's what I really wanted to say on lawfare, and also, how very broadly what we really need to do moving forward in terms of foolproofing ourselves against it, and also how we can more effectively practice it in offensive terms. Now, coming back to the Financial Action Task Force, I'm not really going to get into the nitty-gritty of it, as that's something which Noor did very well, and Iqbal Saab also then very well presented our case in terms of how far and how well we've really been implementing and obeying and complying with those action points that were handed to us. Now, in terms of whether FATF itself is, strictly speaking, as it likes to present itself, a technical and a very objective forum for assessing compliance with its various plans and mutual evaluation reviews, or whether it is a political forum at the end of the day. I think that's critical, because Pakistan has really put out all the stops in terms of complying with a very ambitious and a very stringent action plan that was handed over to it in 2018. And now you know that there are only 3 action points that are left, that we are partially compliant on, and all of those have nothing to do with technical aspects, but all of them have to do with how effective our compliance is. So effective, how effective compliance is cannot be judged in objective terms. Effectiveness is bound to be, the touchstone of effectiveness is bound to have subjectivity. So that's where, politics creeps in. And, just I'd like to share an article here, just to now, I just want to read something just to establish. Now, this is an article which has been written by a research associate at RUSI, which is in the UK, which is one of the world's leading independent think tanks. So, this is not something which IPRI is writing on which Ali is commenting on, but this is a neutral, independent assessment of the fact and how it needs to be reformed and refocused. Now, and I'll just read this, and I'll try to highlight it, because this is what I wanted to do. Until this most recent plenary, where it added another member to its watch list, the 39 members of the FATF have failed to censure one of their own, as opposed to members of its regional bodies, which they have willingly done, despite the fundamental failings of several member countries. Similarly, the country assessment process it oversees has become increasingly politicized. Okay, so that's an independent assessment which clearly establishes that, despite, irrespective of FATF going on and on and on about how technical and how objective it is, the reality is that at the end of the day, it ends up being a political process as well. So we need to be mindful of that, so that we can, of course, respond to this accordingly in diplomatic terms. Now, another thing, so one of the countries which is a member of FATF and which has been very active in terms of ensuring that Pakistan remains under the scanner as far as FATF is concerned is, of course, our eastern neighbor, right? Which leaves no opportunity, which lets go of no opportunity to malign us, to sort of suppress us economically as well. So let me just share another screen just to prove. I hope everybody can read this. FinCEN. Now, FinCEN is an American regulator, financial crimes enforcement network. So there were suspicious activity reports sent by American banks such as JP Morgan, Citi Group, Deutsche Bank to FinCEN, whereby 44 Indian banks, including state banks, private banks in India, totaling transactions over 1 billion. And these were transactions which were money laundering based or terrorist financing based transactions. So India has been, and over a period of 2011 to 2017, that is the time period, which has been covered by this. So this emerged in September of last year. So clearly, there has been, a lot of money laundering, terrorist financing emanating from the Indian financial system, which is clearly at risk as far as FATF standards are concerned. So now what I would like to see, and this I'm saying purely as an international lawyer who wants enforcement of international law and who wants credibility of international law. So if FATF is to maintain its credibility, then the next review of India, which is due in October this year, FATF should very seriously consider also including India under the enhanced watch list and also asking it to satisfy an action plan, just like we've been doing so tirelessly for the last 2 years or so. So that's important for FATF, for the credibility of FATF. So I'm going to end there, and the rest we can take in question and answers. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for such a comprehensive address. We'll move on to Dr. Huma Bakai. Dr. Bakai will be assessing the impact of pay listing on Pakistan's international standing and image.
Thank you so much. And I must congratulate IPRI for doing this. And some very illuminating speeches were made, especially the one just before me. So it almost made lawfare sound like warfare. But having said this, I will start my presentation by starting off with what a Harvard professor once said. A Harvard professor said that in international relations, it doesn't really matter if your story is true or untrue. What matters is, does your story sell? And I think that is the dilemma Pakistan faces today. And that is, does our story sell? Especially in days and times when fake news has acquired a new form and dimension. And all the research that is coming out on fake news is also extremely interesting, because the new paradigm of fake news is not about it being fake. It is about dressing up 0.5 or 0.005 truth in a certain way where it leads people to false conclusions without technically failing a fact check. That is the new premise on which fake news is built. So a technical fact check, that news will not fail, but it is not true. And of course, there is data cherry picking involved, and there is framing, and there is exaggeration. So, and we also know that countries that are in a conflictual relationship with Pakistan have also taken it to the next level and are also exposed now, because the report of Indian Chronicles is now with all of us, and we completely understand what it is. In fact, I was a part of a IPRI deliberation on it as well. And then comes the third challenge. And the third challenge is internal political situation, or the internal political polarization, because it does impact on how your story is pitched abroad. So perhaps I will draw an example from the United States and take it forward. There is Trumpism because of Trump, and now we are talking about Trumpism versus the Biden effect. But one fact continues to be the reality of US, that is bipartisan consensus on issues of national interest, especially whether it is relationship with China or their trust with Russia. So essentially, even when America has perhaps experienced one of the most contentious elections in its lifetime and is also extremely polarized today, the consensus on issues of national interest, which are critical, are largely bipartisan. Unfortunately, if you look at the situation in our country, foreign policy is the first issue to get politicized. Whether it is getting legislation out of the legislation done for FATF, or it is resumption of trade with India. The issues are not seen in the larger perspective of what is best for the state, but are used as whips to flog the sitting government and do political point scoring. And that, of course, impacts your image, not in FATF or any other, everything across the board. If you are a politically divided country where issues of national interest are used to do political point scoring, the loss will be that of the state. And that has been the sad reality of Pakistan for some time. Now, it happens in all countries to a certain extent, but there is this general consensus of not allowing it to escalate to a level where it actually harms the state. Now, is the FATF listing politically motivated? The speaker just before me actually showed you that. Yes, it is. It is very, very politically motivated. Some people call it the prey list instead of the gray list or the black list. And it is indicated by the fact that the two states in the blacklist are Iran and North Korea. So it's pretty obvious how it works. Do we need to comply? The answer is a resounding yes. Yes, we need to comply because of the way things are shaping up in this region. McKinsey and Company forecast that by 2040, the region Asia will account for more than half of world's GDP and 40% of global consumption, which essentially means that Pakistan's continuity in the gray list is going to be an impediment in Pakistan becoming a part of this economic miracle that is unfolding in front of us. And also the fact that Pakistan is located between the two fastest growing economies of the world. It is high time Pakistan tapped its geoeconomic potential and just completely do away with geostrategic lens, and then factors in its image. You see, your image is essentially, if not entirely, what you are. So if you've been a geostrategic state, you've become an ally of the international community in conflict situations, that is your image. So if you're trying to change our image, it is important that we comply with FATF. And I'll tell you why. We need to comply with FATF because FATF is not the only organization that looks at spending. And in other organizations that have looked at Pakistan's standing, which one of them is, it's an index. I'm forgetting the name, but it's in its 46 out. Pakistan's number is 46 out of 146 countries. This came out in 2017, and it is better than Tajikistan, Mali, Kenya, Sierra Leone, Panama, and 30 other countries, which are on various bad numbers, which are not in the gray list, by the way. So, but what happens is that if gray listing for Pakistan happens in FATF, this particular index will also lower Pakistan's listing, and it directly impacts foreign direct investment in Pakistan. So whether we need to comply, the answer is yes, a resounding yes. We can call it politically motivated. We can say it is biased against us. We can say India has worked very hard for not allowing us to get out of it, but we still need to be on the right side of law and get out of the gray listing. What has Pakistan done? Now that's extremely important. FATF's president, Marcus Player, however, has acknowledged that Pakistan had made significant progress, and 3 out of 27 action points still need to be worked on. He also acknowledged the fact that Pakistan was committed to complying with FATF evaluation processes. It was noted by FATF countries that Pakistan is subject to perhaps, now this is what we need to pitch, Pakistan is subject to perhaps the most challenging and comprehensive action plan ever given to any country. And in that, Pakistan was able to comply 3 out of 27 action points, left the rest puzzle. Pakistan's compliance level has been extremely high. It is a technical body. All foreign ministries are for FATF or protecting FATF that say that. But we also know that geopolitics has a huge role to play, with countries using money laundering watchdog as diplomatic leverage. Interestingly, if you look at the timeline of how Pakistan has been in and out of the grey listing, you also realize that it somehow coincides with how our relationship has been shaping up with the United States of America. And that remains a factor. Ladies and gentlemen, it will continue to remain a factor. And what has Pakistan done about it? Pakistan is doing something very important here. And I think, and it is not because US wants us to do it. I think Pakistan is doing it for its own good. There is an internal consensus now that this is what Pakistan needs. And that is that there is a paradigm shift in Pakistan's foreign policy from a state that was categorically considered a geopolitical state. Our new thrust, our new pitch is that we want to be considered a geo-economic state. And to achieve that end, what Pakistan has done is important. And that is that the mantra of our foreign policy is now balance between Beijing and Washington, balance between Tehran and Saudi Arabia. A more important paradigm is the introduction of the term functional relationship with our relationship on all our borders, even with India. And I think that is the most important thrust that is going to help Pakistan out of the FATF grey list, because looking at it technically in isolation is perhaps not going to do the magic. I think the magic will happen when we look at the larger construct of how Pakistan is viewed in the South Asian security metrics. And I'm going to be categorical, and I'll say this here: Pakistan chooses not to become a part of what I call camp politics unfolding in South Asia, which essentially means that yes, we remain in a strategic convergence with Beijing, but we also appease concerns of Washington and improve our relations with India. And you see how things are unfolding. It's no secret now, it's open knowledge that not only our friends from UAE, but also friends from Britain acted very actively in bilateral diplomacy to make sure that Pakistan and India both are nudged towards a better relationship. I think it's once again an opportunity which Pakistan should seek, because you see, the problem is that this confrontation that we have been dragged into and at some time we invested into has had a cost for us, which has become very difficult to bear. I'm going to end my discussion here with what I call the mutually hurting stalemate. I think India-Pakistan's relationship is in what I call a mutually hurting stalemate. It may be hurting us more and hurting them less, or hurting them more and hurting us less, but that is not the debate. Sane countries do not indulge in interactions which are premised around cut your nose to spite your face. They're premised around moving forward. And the moving forward paradigm is premised on connectivity, on tapping the geo-economic potential of Pakistan to use its location for its geopolitical, geo-economic potential, and doing all the right things needed to take it forward. Pakistan's image is gradually improving. We need to walk our talk when we talk about saying that we are a geo-economic state and we are completely committed to non-interference into the affairs of our neighbors. We need to showcase it, we need to walk our talk, and we need to invest in our thrust as a geo-economic state, for which I think Pakistan has an internal consensus, has a consensus at the topmost level. There are issues with public opinion which can be handled intelligently, and that is where the moving forward paradigm exists. It will help Pakistan improve its image and get Pakistan out of the FATF situation. Having said this, despite being in the grey list, Pakistan has not fared so bad. we've been able to sustain the pressure. The politics is exactly what the politics was like for the nuclear suppliers. Rules were different for India and rules were different for Pakistan. We both gate crashed the nuclear. But when the nuclear supply group paradigm emerged, the rules completely unfolded in a different fashion. And at that time, also China supported us. I think countries in the FATF also have complete understanding of the security matrix in the region and how Pakistan may be victimized for its alignment. But I think Pakistan needs to play its cards smartly to now move into what I call the zone of neutrality. That is all from my side. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Our next and final speaker for the webinar is Mr. Hassan Aslam Shad. He will be speaking on way forward and what lessons Pakistan can learn for the future. Mr. Hassan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'm actually very pleased by the I would say, very deep interactions that I've seen so far in this session. The very detailed discussions that we've had so far. I want to, in particular, thank Ali for giving an overview of Lawfare, because that happens to be my area, but he has covered all the essential areas, so that makes it very easy for me to give my short and crisp talk on whatever remains. So I'm just going to basically cover the reasons why Pakistan landed in FATF in the first place, and I think that's very important because we tend to overlook the primary reasons why we are falling behind in the international arena. So let me go through that to give you an overview of why we are lagging behind and what we need to do to come up to speed. So first of all, this is not the first time that we landed in the FATF Lawfare, in the FATF grey list. This was the second time. The biggest mistake that we made as I would say, it was a strategic mistake on our part. We thought that what worked in 2012 when we landed in the grey list in the first place would have worked in 2018. That is the second time we landed in the FATF grey list. Again, I could be wrong in the dates, but the idea I'm trying to drive home is that we thought that what worked in the past would work in the future. Now, that was a mistake because in geostrategic terms, in international law, in terms of politics, what worked in the past does not always work in the future. So we should have known that we need to change our tack. We did not do that, and we assumed that things will become easy for us. Now, that was the first mistake that we made. The second mistake we made was not to understand the sum and substance of the requirements. You see, FATF is an intergovernmental organization. I think everyone has explained what it's all about. It's political / legal. It's got its own requirements. But at the end of the day, there was a sum and substance that we had to meet, and we did not understand that sum and substance. What was that sum and substance? It was combating financing of terrorism and anti-money laundering. Now, that was the result of two UNSC resolutions, 1267, 1373. These resolutions did not come out in 2018 when we were grey listed. They came out way before that. We should have prepared. We should have known what we were supposed to do. We did not. So it's a failure. And this is where I'll take a cue on Ali's point on defensive lawfare. We should have prepared. We should have known what was supposed to hit us. We got pilloried. We got taken by surprise. We were not aware of what needed to be done. Now, this was the first and the biggest failure of Pakistan as a state. We should not have done that. We should have been prepared. Now, the third failure we made in our FATF policy was blaming everything on India and the US. Let me be clear. India is behind this, and there are no questions about that. They have been at our heads for the last, 73 or whatever, 80 years. I mean, they are not going to give up on gunning for our heads. The point I'm trying to drive home is that we should have known that India is behind this. We should have known that India is going to gun for our heads. Instead, the biggest mistake we made was we focused our energies on India alone. That's a mistake. In a defensive or offensive lawfare defined as use of law as a weapon of war, you don't concentrate your energies on only becoming defensive, only trying to deflect the blame. You become aggressive. You try and explain to the world why what you're doing is the right thing that you're doing. We failed. We failed to do that. We should have learned that lesson. We did not learn that lesson. And the biggest pitfall of focusing on India was that we stopped trying to do what we were supposed to do by FATF. So basically, because our energies were being expended on the wrong place, we did not do the work that we were required to do. Again, that was a failing of the state. We should realize that if something is imposed on us or something is bestowed on us by the international community, we should focus on doing that. We should not be targeting India, because although India is responsible for it, if we show the world that we are focusing on India, it is going to make us appear as deflecting blame. Whenever it comes to world affairs, whenever it comes to international community, if you are seen as deflecting blame, you become a victim, and victims are weak. We don't want to be weak. We are not weak. So this was the third problem. The fourth problem that we made was a result of certain historic trends that have continued in our country. That, in my view, did affect our reputation before the world. Recently, the killers of Daniel Pearl got away, and that was a big sort of dent in our, effort to patch up with Joe Biden, the new president of the United States. There are certain things the world looks at us for, and we fail to do that. Now, that did work against us. So in the end, optics do matter. So we did not do anything good for ourselves in terms of helping our optics. We did something that worked against us. So the last thing that I think we fail to do when it comes to FATF, and I'm now talking about a tactical strategy, is that we did not create a centralized institution that understood what we were required to do and what needed to be done to get ourselves out of the FATF grey list. Now, the reason why I say that is because when we landed in the FATF grey list in June 2018, it took us a very long time to understand, as I said, the sum and substance of the requirements. After that, there should have been a centralized body that should have been coordinating the efforts on FATF. It should have been the sort of the pivot that should have been calling all the intergovernmental agencies on what needed to be done and given the powers to ensure that its directives are implemented in letter and spirit. Now, that did not happen. Now, for the future, I think what we need to do is we need to understand that lawfare as a strategy can only be implemented if we have a centralized body that calls the shots. It tells other intergovernmental organizations and ministries and bodies on what needs to be done. And then it has the power to enforce its decisions, because power to enforce decisions comes with sanction. There has to be some sort of an authority given to that body to ensure that those that do not comply with its directives are going to be taken to task. Now, if we had a centralized body, we probably would have been in a different place today. Unfortunately, we did not do that. So my recommendation for the future is that Pakistan should centralize its lawfare strategy. Again, going back to Ali, who gave a brilliant analysis of lawfare and what needs to be done. All I can add to what he said is that we need to centralize lawfare. We need to have a ministry that oversees all these things. And let me tell you something, my fear is it's not the last time that Pakistan has landed on the wrong side of international law compliance. It's going to happen more because we are not in the camp that the world would like us to be in. When I say the word world, I mean the US, the world powers, the West. We are in the Chinese camp for good or bad reasons, and we will be pressurized by the world to comply with their requirements. And therefore, it's all the more important for us to have a lawfare strategy which defines what we are all about, what we need to do, how we are going to counter the legal requirements that are thrown on us. So it's better to be prepared and to be in a position to challenge this head on instead of being caught unawares. I think that should be it from my side.
Thank you so much, sir. We'll move directly to the question and answer session. We have loads of questions coming in, which I do believe is a good sign. I'll jump right into the first one. The question is addressed to Ms. Noor Fatma and Mr. Ali Sultan. Now, there's been mention of domestic and administrative weaknesses on part of Pakistan's response to FATF and the action plans that they've imposed on us. Dr. Bakai has even mentioned political polarization within the country, but how much do you think does criminal justice reform matter? And I assuming that it does. What are your recommendations in order to go about reforming the criminal justice system?
I can start off with that. That's a very good question, and I feel that criminal justice reform should be at the heart and center of any initiative that we take, whether it's getting off the gray list or abiding by our other human rights obligations. If we look at the mutual evaluation report that was issued in 2019, it was found that 2,500 cases, money laundering cases, were undertaken by the government of Pakistan, and yet we only had conviction on one case, which shows that there is a very poor understanding of money laundering. There is a huge gap in the training and the knowledge of our investigating officers that are at the front line of investigating terrorism financing and money laundering cases in Pakistan. They do not understand what these offenses are, how sophisticated the networks can be when these crimes are committed and when these things play out. There is a dire need to start not just training our investigating officers, but also training our prosecutors so that we can build cases and conduct effective prosecutions. There's a need to train our judges so that they realize the importance of FATF recommendations, our laws, our anti-terrorism frameworks, our UNSC laws that we are now obligated to abide by, and implement these recommendations and understand the nuances of money laundering and terrorism financing offenses. So criminal justice sector reform, I would say, it's a long-term project. It's obviously something that's not going to happen overnight, but in the points that are there on the action plan, we have been asked to demonstrate effectiveness and demonstrate convictions, demonstrate quantitatively that we are convicting people on terrorism financing offenses, money laundering offenses, and that cannot be done until and unless we start training our justice sector actors, our judiciary, our prosecutors and investigators to understand what these offenses are, how they can play out, and of course, successfully lead them to fruition. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Well, just to build up on what Noor just said, I absolutely agree with what she has said in its entirety, in particular capacity building for the investigators, the prosecutors, and the judges as well. And this also will, of course, then align itself with what Hassan was saying, which is that we got in this mess in the first place because we failed to appreciate the nuances and the sophistication of what was required from us in the first place. So hopefully that will not happen in the future, because we must remember that we're going to be under FATF review once every 7 to 10 years. So it's an ongoing process. So we can't let our guard down, and we should use this opportunity for learning for the future as well. So I think that's what needs to be said in terms of reforming the criminal justice system. One can have day-long seminars on it. It is actually so extensive, but you need, of course, political will in order to bring effective reforms. And one more thing that I would say is that whatever changes that we have made and whatever capacity that we have built, even if it was as a result of this FATF sword of Damocles which was hanging over our head, in the long run, it has actually benefited our economic and financial system.
Absolutely.
And maybe if we didn't have this sword of Damocles hanging over our head, we perhaps would never have undertaken these changes on our own.
Ali,
So
you are
think
absolutely
of
right.
so think of the enormous increase in the money supply in the formal sector of the economy now, which we can tax, which prior to these changes was not taxable. So all of this in the long run, of course, is going to be of enormous benefit to us. So, yes, it has been problematic for us. We have suffered economically because of this, and we're continuing to suffer economically because of this. But the positive also, the silver lining in this would be that in the long run, our system will actually benefit from these reforms.
Yeah.
Perfect. Now, while we have you, Mr. Ali Sultan, there's another question that has been addressed to you by Ms. Varda Ahmed. Now, this question is in two parts, and please bear with me as I read it out to you. Do you think that Pakistan should acquire lawfare as a preventive security measure to counter such strategies against itself? Also, how do you see Pakistan's role in setting the standards or agreeing to the standards which FATF imposes on us? Because most of those standards were set when countries were gaining independence and weren't in a position to effectively negotiate better terms, which would have helped developing states.
Well, I think the first part in terms of using lawfare as a preventive security strategy is something that I covered in my talk as well. Yes, I advocate that, and that would be a more offensive approach, not adopting a defensive mindset when it comes to international law, because it does require you to create opportunities also. And one should always be looking for those opportunities, which is why, as Hassan rightly mentioned, there needs to be a centralized hub of international law expertise in Pakistan, which is overseeing and developing such strategies for Pakistan. Now, the second part is very interesting because, and thank you for asking me this, because this is something that I should have mentioned in my talk also. One of the things which we do is that we don't participate in international law conferences and international law meetings. We leave our seat empty at the table, where we have all the opportunity and we're given the chance to present our point of view on a particular developing area of the law. So when it comes to FATF, APG, which is what we're a member of, but as Iqbal Saab was mentioning, now Pakistan is also going to be applying for the membership of the FATF itself. So it's really up to us how proactive we want to be, how much we want to participate in all of these fora, and so on and so forth. And right now, it is true that there are many conferences, there are many occasions where Pakistan can be better represented, and Pakistan can actually, not just being better represented, but Pakistan first needs to volunteer to represent itself at those fora. So yes, moving forward, we need to do that because international law can only develop by a consensus. It cannot be imposed by a tiny minority of states on an unwilling majority. So we need to find alliances with other developing countries, with countries who've had similar experiences as us moving forward.
Thank you, sir. So the next question we have is from Mr. Imran Nasir, directed to Mr. Iqbal Khan. Mr. Imran Nasir asks, rather narrates, that in Pakistan's social setup, charity is considered as part of the faith. How can we stop this charity falling in the hands of terror financiers?
Can you repeat the last part? Sorry, yeah.
The question itself. So the question itself is that in Pakistan's social setup, charity is considered to be part of the faith. In that context, how can we stop this charity falling into the hands of terror financiers?
It must be clear that, first of all, the non-profit organizations, for that matter, are charities. They are not discouraged at the FATF level at all. And that's something we should be very much clear to it. The FATF does understand that a number of non-profit organizations, rather a large number of non-profit organizations, are engaged in charitable work, which they call the good work for that matter, and they continue contributing to the society apart from the state, which it does itself. So the FATF does encourages that this process should continue. So that is something which should be very much clear to it. What the FATF looks into is that these charitable organizations or NPOs, for that matter, should not be misused for the financing of terrorism. That is the only concern. So we must be very clear about that not only it's in our faith, of course, that we do deliver charities. It is also within the FATF guidance that the charitable organizations contribute to the good work and should continue doing so and should be encouraged for that matter. That must be very much clear to us. So in the Pakistani context, what all I could say is that when we are donating to a particular organization or entity, we need to be a little, careful in the sense that we need to know what kind of organization or NPO, for that matter, that is, and whether that is a proscribed organization, the list of which is available and can be seen on the NACTA's website, or whether that is a UN designated entity, for that matter, the list of which can be seen on the MOFA website. So a little cautiousness and a little carefulness is required while donating that. And that is also the requirement of our religion also, that whatever we donate, that should actually land into the hands which actually use that donation for the welfare of the society and for the good work that is intended to be done. So that is something which is very much required. Otherwise, generally speaking, in terms of donations, there is no such strict limitation or prohibition that we can take into account from the FATF guidance. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So the next question we have is addressed to Dr. Huma Bakai by Ms. Amna Ijaz Rafi. Ms. Amna wants to know, or rather again narrate, that Pakistan under FATF is being exploited by internal as well as regional quarters to push back Pakistan's geoeconomic potential. Thereby, how do you think Pakistan needs to respond diplomatically, and how will its relationship with East Asian states play a role in doing so?
I think Pakistan has already charted out something which I find very, very encouraging. One is that I think despite the political polarization that existed inside the country and was becoming an impediment in pursuing the legislation which would take us forward on the FATF plan, the issue was somehow taken care of. And although the opposition played dirty on it, but it was herded into consensus. So that is something we overcame. Now, I've said it before, I'm going to repeat this at the risk of repeating myself. You see, Pakistan is almost being pushed into what I call camp politics. And Pakistan has to really do some very smart diplomatic footwork to make sure that it protects its interest, but at the same time finds a place for itself in what I call the neutrality zone. And the neutrality zone is that where the key word for our foreign policy is balance. I am completely in support of Pakistan carrying on with the convergence that it has with Beijing. But at the same time, Pakistan has to, and I think it has stopped turning its relationships into zero-sum games. The relationship with Beijing should not come at the expense of our relationship with Washington, nor should we make any policy choices where we are pushed into what a categorized camp politics, especially if new Cold War is unfolding in this region. A very important dimension of this is that the key player here, because the confrontation is between China and the United States of America, and that is the defining theme of our interstate relations at this moment in time. China is not for acute confrontation. China is perhaps for competition, drawing red lines, giving a message, and then moving on to a path of what I call cooperative mechanism. It is actually the United States of America which has to decide that acute confrontation is not an option, perhaps some competition leading to cooperation where it matters. And if you look at the crisscross of geoeconomics and geopolitics, you realize that it's not such a far-fetched thing. There's a crisscross of geoeconomics and geopolitics between China and India, and also between China and the United States of America. Their economies are entangled, and that should be our way forward. And this is where it is extremely important for Pakistan to be in what I call the zone of neutrality.
Thank you, ma'am. So the next question we have is addressed to anyone from the panel who would want to answer. And the question is, what are the 3 outstanding points, action points that have been imposed on FATF by us? And what is their qualitative compliance requirement? And where do we stand on those 3? Ms. Noor Fatma, would you want to go ahead with the question?
Sure. So, as has been mentioned before, we have almost full compliance, significant compliance with 24 out of 27 points. The 3 outstanding areas that are currently still pending on behalf of Pakistan pertain to demonstrating that terrorism financing investigations and prosecutions target persons and entities or target other persons and entities that act at the direction of designated. Second is, I think, demonstrating that terrorism prosecutions are dissuasive, are effective and proportionate dissuasive sanctions are being levied, and all targeted financial sanctions are levied against 1267 UNSC resolutions 1267 and 1373 resolutions. Designated persons are are subjected to these targeted financial sanctions. So at the forefront, this is more CTF oriented. This means that we are now required to demonstrate that whatever rules that we have for targeted financial sanctions, they are operational, they are working to produce results, and demonstrating that means ensuring that our prosecutors are creating cases and our investigators are investigating and coming up with a form of evidence. And our judges are using all these things and coming up with convictions and demonstrating that, yes, our investigation and prosecutor frameworks are solid, and we are now at a place where we can rectify all these issues that come up when it comes to terrorism financing investigations.
I would just like to add some further to what Fatma said, and it's very important to note that it's not the entire ambit of terrorist financing investigations, prosecutions, or convictions for that matter, or the entire ambit of targeted financial sanctions that is pending. You know, these are the larger areas which we are discussing, but each area had a number of action items. So if we talk of terrorist financing investigations, prosecutions, or convictions, so there were 8 action items in that particular category. And if we talk of targeted financial sanctions, there were 9 action items or 9 actions for that matter in that particular category. So all other actions have been already addressed. Now, even in these areas, the terrorist financing investigations, prosecutions, or that targeted financial sanctions, most of the work has already been done. And as I said earlier, 90% of these remaining 3 actions, in our opinion, were already addressed during the last, plenary meeting. So it was just a few minor issues or the few issues within these 3 action items which were pending, and not the action items entirely for that matter. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So the next question we have is directed to Mr. Hassan Aslam Shad, but is open with the panel. The question is, how can Pakistan regulate Hundi Hawala despite how it's used inside the country?
So, look, I mean, these are not questions I'm going to be able to satisfactorily answer because of the very simple reason that I'm giving a general overview of what we need to think about in terms of our strategy. I think this is a question that perhaps can be answered better by Noor Fatma or perhaps by Dr. Homa Bakai. The thing I'm trying to drive home is the fact that we need to wake up. We need to understand the requirements of international law. We need to be prepared. We need to do the groundwork at the local level. We need to also understand that the world is not going to side with us if we only talk about India, because India is loved by the international community, whether we like it or not. And if we want to create a space for ourselves, we are going to have to play it smart. We will have to give the world what it needs to listen to. There is a lingua franca. There is a language the world needs to hear. And that language is about, international law, about international development, women's rights, and all that. I'm not saying that we change our narrative at home. I'm not saying that. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that we turn ourselves on the head and we start doing what the world, pleases. No. What I'm saying is that we need to understand and we need to act upon certain things, like, for example, giving our institutions a chance, giving our people a chance, giving ourselves a chance for that matter, building ourselves, developing ourselves as a country, as a people, as a nation, and then telling the world what we want. Look, let me be clear. The world does not listen to people who have no money in their pocket and who are only coming to ask for money. No, it doesn't work like that. If you want to get respect in the world, you need to be strong. You need not when I say strong, I don't just mean militarily. I think we are militarily strong to defend ourselves against Indian aggression, against Afghan aggression. No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about defending ourselves against arguments that are given to us by the international community. The questions that we face, we need to have a coherent and a clear story. I'm sorry, I've gone into this detailed sort of tangent, but these are my thoughts about Pakistan. If we want to be strong, we need to look inwards, we need to be strong, we need to be prepared, and we need to first get ourselves prepared to face the battles that the world is throwing at us.
I just want to add one sentence here. You see, we need to have this internal consensus, and we need to actually bring our people on board. And that is, we're doing this for Pakistan. It's not because the US is telling us to do it. It's not because the FATF compliance laws are such. It is because we as a country need to put our house in order and get ourselves away from these anomalies that exist, which does not allow us to pitch our story the way we should be able to do it. We are literally holding back Pakistan by not investing in putting our house in order. It's as simple as that. So whether it is Hundi, whether it's Hawala, whether it's FBR, whether it's our tax collection, whether it's our inter-provincial harmony, all of that, we need to address these issues because we need to improve our image. And we live in a world where we're under international searchlights. You can only build an image when you have an image. You can pitch what you have.
Absolutely,
so
Dr.
you need to build a story there.
Absolutely. You've said it so well. I couldn't have said it this way.
Points well made, Dr. Homa and Mr. Hassan Aslam, but I'd like to persist on the question of Hawala Hundi, and I'd like to bring in Mr. Muhammad Iqbal Khan into the conversation, if you could, sir, and share your thoughts on the question.
Sorry, I was just aware. Can you repeat the question for me? I'm sorry for that.
So the question is, how can Pakistan regulate Hundi Hawala despite how it's used inside the country?
All right, that is something I'm not very much expert, because that is entirely a domain which is a little different, and which is basically looked into by the State Bank of Pakistan and the FIA. So I would not be in a position, because you understand that if I say something that may come up with a kind of, an official position. So if you excuse me, I would not be in a position to answer this question.
That's perfectly understandable, sir. We'll move on to the last question of the webinar. The question is addressed to Ms. Noor Fatma. And I do believe that this has been referred to in presentations across the webinar, but again, because this question has been asked frequently, the question is that you mentioned that FATF has been evolving as an organization, and so are its evaluation mechanism. This is one of the reasons why Pakistan, despite its progress, is still on the grey list. With FATF evolving, how could Pakistan get itself off the list? And are we chasing unachievable goals?
That's an excellent question. And just to start off, from a technical perspective, the FATF comes up with its own methodology, which is updated regularly. The last time this methodology was updated was in late 2020. And some new elements that were added to the specific 40 recommendations included new aspects such as protecting data rights and privacy of individuals whose data is being used in investigations and prosecutions and all of that. So that was a new element. Before that, I would also like to say that when I said that the FATF is evolving, I meant if you look at the broader structure of the body, it started out as a very specific mandated body with, I think, a year's worth of mandate, and then it expanded later on, and then after 9/11, with the passage of UNSC resolutions 1267 and 1373, particularly it got an even bigger role, and it started looking at areas of terrorism financing in way more detail. And it was the first organization at an international level that was actively engaged on such matters, apart from UNSC sanctions committees, that is. So yes, the FATF is evolving, but what I would need to emphasize, and what has been discussed earlier by our panelists as well, is that we need to keep up with the FATF. We cannot consider ourselves isolated or siloed off from the functioning of global governance bodies. We need to be co-opted into the international financial system, especially in the future. As Dr. Huma mentioned, this region will take off in very, very significant ways economically and strategically. We need to prepare for that. We need to make sure that our financial systems are in order, our house is in order. And when it comes to the FATF laws, particularly the 15 FATF laws that were passed last year, I feel that there is political consensus. All parties across the board within Pakistan are on the same page when it comes to getting off of the grey list. But what we should be doing, and just to tie in a bit of the lawfare element here, is not just get off the grey list, but also use our experience becoming grey listed and then getting off the grey listed by using our legal frameworks, by using our regulatory frameworks, by coordinating law enforcement action, harmonizing and institutionalizing sectors of the economy that were previously without any supervision at all. All these things need to be, there needs to be a narrative, and that narrative needs to be communicated to global governance organizations such as the FATF, such as other donor bodies, for example, IMF, World Bank, whatnot. The aim is to capitalize on our successes and communicate that, so that we can also not just do well on our obligation, international obligations, but establish ourselves and our reputation as a responsible member of the international community.
May I please come in here for a second?
Sure.
May I please come in here? You know what? I completely agree with Noor, but you need to understand something, and I think that is important. And we must end on a positive note. And the positive note is that the FATF member countries said that Pakistan is subject to perhaps the most challenging and comprehensive action plan ever given to any country. And despite that, Pakistan has done extremely well. We've just left out 3. So I think Pakistan has done well. we will get out of the gray list. And I think there's consensus among the members also that the progress that Pakistan has made is substantial. So we just need to keep on this track, keep working. And I think it's very encouraging. What has happened so far in these plenary meetings is actually encouraging. It has not been against Pakistan. Pakistan has fought well. It has done things to get itself not out of the gray list, but it has definitely raised its image. And if we keep on that track, I can conveniently sort of conclude on this positive note that we'll be able to get out of the gray list. But yes, we have to work consistently on it.
Absolutely, ma'am. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd now like to invite our acting president, Brigadier Rashid Wali Janjua, for his closing remarks and his vote of thanks.
Thanks, Waleed. I extend my felicitations for a very engaging and very absorbing discourse to all the distinguished panelists, and each one in his or her right has come up with original recommendations, and it was a no holds barred discussion. And the biggest message that we garner is that Pakistan was given the most challenging and comprehensive. It's much about the political angle that we were subjected to, but as we discussed, there's a silver lining, and it's all for the good that our compliance will strengthen that financial architecture, and that would enhance the country's standing in Asia and the globe. There were very interesting takeaways, like we need to be careful about the obligations we accept, because those ultimately have to be matched with domestic laws. So this is an area in which our international law expertise also comes in. And I couldn't agree more with the panelists that we should be more proactive rather than relying on defensive lawfare by building the right kind of capacities. And one of those capacities could be a centralized hub. And this is an area which could be debated further with more with people with more expertise to understand what kind of a centralized international law hub do we really require in the presence of Ministry of Law and Justice. And there's a hub, FATF hub in NACTA as well. And our grey listing, Dr. Makai mentioned, was linked to our standing in South Asia. And I could agree with that verity that where we stand on the South Asian security matrix determines our real standing. And our new security paradigm, which points the way towards geoeconomics, might be a silver lining. And I think the way ahead is full of promise for us. There are certain traps that were mentioned by Dr. Shah, I think very well covered, that we should eschew our tendency to deflect the blame and accept these compliances in the right spirit, because even if by default, those would go to increase our standing and capacity as a responsible country. The capacity building aspect and the coordination, again, I think the two law experts, I couldn't agree more with them. But the most important point was what Dr. Mukai also mentioned. It doesn't matter whether what you say, true or false, it should be acceptable. And I think we need better strategic communications, because Pakistan, as was very encouraging message by the practitioners like Iqbal, that 90% of the compliances, even on those 3 points which are pending and on which the qualitative compliance is desired, 90% action items have been addressed. But then why is that not resonating is something that our strategic communication experts need to ponder. So overall, very useful discussion. And I'm sure that we can have more discussion like that and learn from the distinguished panelists in future also. So, and then I again thank all of you for a very absorbing discourse. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of today's webinar on deconstructing the FATF through a legal lens. I thank all our speakers for extending their points of view very eloquently. I thank all our participants for sending in their questions and their active participation. Please do follow us on our social media pages to stay updated on our research activities and our events. Thank you so much once again. Khuda Hafiz. Good.